Muted. Okay, I was muted. Sorry about that. All right, so I'll just welcome everyone, just kick off the meeting. I can't really see who's on the call right now, but just want to welcome everybody to our May event. This is a YPT discussion featuring Jerome Horne and Frank Murphy. They have both contributed in their own right to the transportation realm, so they're very influential, want to have a great discussion with us. I just want to say thank you to everyone who attended our February meeting. We had really good turnout, and that was our first event. So I was hoping that we could take a few seconds to just kick off and introduce the 2021 board, just in case you want to stay connected with us in the future, but just to reintroduce ourselves. So I'll start. My name is Brandy McCoy. I'm an environmental planner at KLT Group, and I'm serving as your chair this year. So I'll send it to, I think I see Brian.
Sure. My name is Brian Seal. I work for Baltimore City DOT, and I will be the moderator today, and I'm the communication chair.
Hi, everybody. I'm Leah Vasakowitz. I'm the deputy chair of YPT Baltimore, and I work with Brandy at KLT.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Duckett. I work for JMT, and I'm partnerships for YPT Baltimore this year.
Okay, anyone else on?
Hello. Yep. Good evening. My name is Jan Williams. I serve as the vice chair of programs, and I'm currently with Baltimore City Public Schools.
And Jade Clayton, originally logged in as Brandy, changed my name, chair of administration in YPT Baltimore.
And I'm Mike Brown here at JMT.
I think is Cray on the line. No, sorry about that. I think I sent the link internally, so you might see a lot of Brandy's, but everyone has their own name. So that was a rookie mistake on my part. But yeah, just have a few announcements before we get going. I think we're excited on the board to share this information. I think you guys will be, because we're all, we're here on a Tuesday at 6:30. So I think you'll be excited to hear that we're going to do transportation camp this year. We're looking to do something outside and virtual. So that'll get us back into being together and maybe have a conference of some sort. But if you have not attended transportation camp, it's a great opportunity to get involved, and it's a great opportunity to attend an event that's pretty much what they call it, an unconference. It started in 2011. It takes out the structure, the rigidity, and induces like the fun, the active conversation in the transportation planning realm. So we're really excited to get started doing that. We are in the stages of putting together a planning team, and we'd like to extend the invite to our network. So if you would like to be involved, if you've attended and you want to get involved in the network and in the event, we're going to be setting up a planning kickoff meeting so that you can join and we can get started on that planning. I believe we can put the information in the chat, but we invite you to submit your contact information to yptbaltimore@gmail.com, and that'll start us getting started on planning this great event for everyone. And I think that's it for me, and I will turn it over to Megan. She would like to thank a few people for being here as well.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, everybody, for joining us tonight. I do just want to take a second to acknowledge the different transportation-related organizations that are joining us tonight and thank them for helping us spread the word about tonight's event to their communities and to help make tonight a success. So if any of those organizations want to briefly talk about any upcoming events or opportunities that they have coming in the next few months, please feel free to unmute yourselves and do so now.
Hi, I'm Alex Holt, transportation correspondent for Greater Washington. Been to a couple of these events. I'm just happy to be on in for tonight's talk.
Great, thank you for joining us.
Hey, good evening. This is John Kristofi. I'm the secretary with WDC Site, the WDC section of ITE. We're also happy to participate tonight, and looks like a great discussion going forward. We do have an event coming up on the 19th, so it's going to be a tech talk with UMD and the CAT Lab, as well as MDOT's Active Transportation Management Program. So be on the lookout for that.
Great, thank you, John. Anybody else wants to share before we get started with the discussion? Go ahead. All right, I think we can go ahead and turn it over. I'll turn it over to Brian Seal. He's going to start our panel discussion for us.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Megan, for kicking that off. We have a real treat today. We have Jerome Horne and Frank Murphy. We're going to be talking about transportation past and future, especially as we're talking about an infrastructure package that is potentially a lot of money being put into transportation and to various other things. A lot of potential changes in Baltimore City here, and so we wanted to have this discussion kind of looking at like what was going on the last time that we had some of these big infusions of money. The most obvious of that being when we had the interstate system, and we are honored to have Frank Murphy, who has been with the Department of Transportation for nearly 50 years now. When we were preparing for this, he mentioned that he joined the Department of Transportation in the Nixon administration. It was in the last 2 weeks of it, but it was all the way back in the Nixon administration. So he has seen a lot of things. He's worked on a lot of projects. He is an absolute wealth of knowledge. Frank, I'm absolutely honored that you're here. So first off, you have been a part of so many things. Can you talk about a bit about the arc of your career and how you got started with transportation and like how you got here?
Well, it's funny. I went to school at Drexel University in Philadelphia, and as a senior, the school brought employers onto the campus to interview the graduating seniors. And Maryland State Highway Administration was one of those employers, and I was interested in working for SHA. So I signed up for the interview, but the interviewer didn't show up. So the school forwarded our resumes to the state, and they sent us an application. I filled that out, and months went by, and I'm thinking, I got to get a job. I'm going to graduate soon. What am I going to do? Well, I had met Richard Trainer, who ran the interstate division for Baltimore City, and I had gotten some information from him over the last year of my schooling. And when I couldn't get an answer out of the state personnel office, I called him because I know he was an SHA employee and asked for his advice. He said, "Oh, don't worry about it. I'll hire you." And that's how I got my job. So I never really had to interview. So when I started, the city was building interstate highways like I-95 and Martin Luther King Boulevard and the highway to nowhere, and extending 83 downtown, I guess for the first 10 years. And then for the next 10 years after that, the freeways were done. The city built some arterials like Boston Street and Key Highway, or rebuilt actually. And then I guess the 10 years after that, it was more spot improvements, a left turn lane here, a change in signalization there. And they were all, capacity increases. And now we're kind of doing capacity decreases as part of complete streets or at least capacity as far as motor vehicles is concerned, because we're repurposing street space for bike facilities and for more pedestrian space and, parking, transit lanes. So it's gone through a big change in the 47 years that I've been here.
Yeah, that is quite the understatement, saying that it's gone through some changes. And that is why we're also honored to have Jerome Horne here, who is much younger in his career than Frank is. Jerome, if you haven't heard of Jerome, he is as you can see behind him. He actually has a transit museum, which is currently in Indianapolis, but it will soon be in Baltimore because we were able to poach him. Unfortunately, not to Baltimore City DOT yet, but the transit museum will be joining us here in Baltimore City here soon. He was also one of the 40 under 40, transit 40 under 40 last year. And he's also been featured on quite a few podcasts where he talks about a lot of national issues. They're talking about transportation, talking about a lot of things that are going on at the federal level, which is especially pertinent here as we talk about where a lot of this federal money would be coming from. But Jerome, you've done a lot of really interesting things in Indianapolis there. You know, from the red line, the other red line, not Baltimore City's red line, unfortunately. But can you talk a little bit about what got you into transportation and some of the things that you've worked on?
Absolutely. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm honored to be here, honored to be on this panel with Frank and to participate in this great discussion. So a little bit about me. I am originally from Baltimore. Was born in Sinai Hospital on a rainy evening on March 26, 1988. And lived there for the first 12 years of my life, and then moved down to Atlanta, and then eventually ended up in Indianapolis, Indiana. But I've always been fascinated by cities and transportation since I was a little kid. And when I was 10 years old, I sent what I believe was my first email to the administrator of the MTA at that time. So that would have been circa 1998. It was Ronald Freeland. And basically, as a little 10-year-old kid, I said, hey, how can I get your job when I grow up? And so even at that age, I was thinking about how I could be a transit CEO. So for some reason, and he actually responded, and it was a real kind of heartfelt personal response, and that sort of lit a spark at that age. And I took a little bit of an interesting path. I am not a planner by traditional training. I ended up going to school for music, was a music major, really thought I was a band nerd before I was a transit nerd, and thought that's what I wanted to do, but eventually wanted to get back into what I really fell in love with as a kid. And I'd say what really did it for me was riding the Baltimore subway as a kid. That front window, I call it the railfan window, where you can sit at the front seat and kind of look out the front window of the train. As a kid, I loved that. I was always fascinated by that, especially going underground between West Cold Spring and Mondawmin Station. That just, I don't know, it just did something for me. So that's really where the spark sort of came from. But ended up getting into the transit world, switching from music in 2015. And by that time, I had moved to Indianapolis, and there happened to be an opening at the transit agency for community engagement coordinator. So IndyGo is the transit agency for Indianapolis. And that's how I sort of got a foot in the door through community engagement. And once I was in the field, it really kind of just was my passion. It's what I've always wanted to do. And so kind of quickly rose through a few promotions at IndyGo. And I was there at a whirlwind time where we got to see a transit referendum pass for dedicated funding, bus system redesign, opening the nation's first all battery electric BRT, a new transit center downtown, a new fare payment system, a new CAD AVL or computer aided dispatch auto vehicle location system, for those of you who know what that is. So I got to see a lot of things happen in a really short amount of time at IndyGo, and really learn a lot and get a crash course in community engagement and government affairs work, and research, and really kind of being on the forefront of what was happening in the transit industry. And that's sort of what led me to where I am today, where I now work for Foursquare Integrated Transportation Planning. So we are a wonderful women-owned and founded transportation firm that is based in the DC region, but has satellite offices in a few other cities in the Northeast. And started there back in February. And we do a lot of really amazing work with transit corridor planning, transportation demand management, bus system redesigns, bike ped plans, you name it. But we are celebrating our 15th anniversary this year, and I'm excited to take my career to the next step, helping out Foursquare.
Awesome. So Frank, you were part of the transportation department while Baltimore was building so many of these things. When Baltimore was building the subway system that young Jerome would eventually use to kind of get him into transportation. Around that same time, we were also building the extension on the JFX. We were we had done you were a part of the US 40 in West Baltimore, known as the Highway to Nowhere. You were involved with the Fort McHenry Tunnel south of the city. What did you see as what was going on then when we had so much interest in building transportation systems? We were across the country. We were putting in RTAs. There was so much energy behind transportation, and especially in the years since, it feels like that's kind of waned. Like as you said when you were introducing yourself, we've gone from capacity, expansion of car capacity to reduction, as you refer to it. What do you think has been the thing that's really kind of driven that change?
Well, I think a couple of things. Actually, let me digress for just a moment and say I'm excited to be at this event, and our colleague from Indianapolis. Looks like we share something else that we didn't know about, and that is music. I played in bands for about 50 years, and in fact, as far back as 1969, the band I was in was the opening act at Loyola College for a concert with the Byrds. And who knows that we'd never have an involvement with anybody famous for 40 years after that. But so apparently we have even more in common. I guess as far as, so I guess the question was more kind of what's driven the changes. Is that what you're saying? Well, I think
yeah, basically.
I think there's been a kind of a wholesale change in the interest of the public. When I started, the thinking was kind of like the government was a benevolent dictator and they planned and put things in place and everybody accepted them. Nowadays, I think people, want to have a voice much more than was the case back in those days. And people are looking for things like impacts on neighborhoods and, quality of life issues. I think some other things have gotten out of hand a little bit that have driven that discussion, such as aggressive driving. As we've all seen, there's some pretty outrageous things that some drivers will do without any consideration of the impacts that they have on neighborhoods or pedestrians. And I think those things have kind of lit a fire in a lot of the public to say we are no longer as concerned about somebody who may commute from Caucusville or Catonsville or Glen Burnie to go to work every day. We're a city and they have to drive through our neighborhoods, and if they're going to do it, we need them to do it with respect and to maintain safety. And I think it's a very different mindset. It's interesting.
And Jerome, if you want to kind of the same question, from your perspective, as opposed to being a professional in transportation, seeing these things, what do you see as kind of the driving factor of what was different in the 50s, 60s, and 70s compared to now?
Yeah, I think in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, clearly we were very concerned about moving as many cars as fast as possible through cities, right? And so there's a lot of, where we introduced a lot of one-way streets and prioritizing parking, and there were also cultural and socioeconomic shifts, right? I mean, we have to be real about there was the suburbanization and white flight and things like that were also going on, contributing to some of the decisions that were made about transportation and prioritizing movement of cars as quickly as possible. And I think to what Frank was alluding to, now we're coming to a realization of a lot, whether it's dealing with histories of structural racism or just quality of life issues, that we want to give people options. We want to make cities more livable. We are thinking about the quality of life and what that means. And so I think the capacity reduction for maybe single occupancy vehicles and cars is happening, but we're looking at how do we make our cities and neighborhoods more connected, more vibrant? How do we do that in a way that is equitable? How do we do that in a way that allows people to have multiple choices and make those choices all good choices? And so I think that's kind of a reflection in what we're seeing today. And the recently released Complete Streets Manual, right, is a great step in that direction, kind of helping us prescribe and identify and give different typologies to streets, and what even define what is a street, who is a street for, and that's really kind of a general overview of what's driving these changes.
Yeah, that's a great segue. Frank, you were involved with the department while the Complete Streets Manual was being drafted. It wasn't a program that the department kind of started. It was legislation from the city council. But can you talk about like what Complete Streets really is going to mean, especially here in Baltimore? I don't think there's been a lot of other cities that have Complete Streets Manuals as extensive as ours, or as extensive as ours. So what do you see Complete Streets meaning here in Baltimore? And like, are we going to just expect that by the end of the year every street is going to be a complete street?
Well, that's a complicated question, I guess, and I think that the concept of complete streets is fairly complicated. There are those folks who may think that means every street should have a bike lane, should have parking, should have pedestrian space, should have the ability to convey trucks, should have a transit lane. Obviously, the streets don't have enough room for all those things on one street. There still needs to be some, determination of, maybe this street's a truck route and one over there is a bus route. So, but I think that, and we're very lucky in Baltimore that we have a young engineer, Graham Young. I don't know if you know Graham, but a very competent, talented engineer, and he also gets it in terms of complete streets. He's a complete streets manager, and I suspect he's probably one of the best in the country at doing that. He oversaw the development of the Complete Streets Manual, and I think it's kind of, the stars are sort of aligned about complete streets, because one of the things when it all started, I was curious of how things were going to work when we started taking, making capacity reductions to the, what used to be called the silent majority, if you will, the people that drive to work every day. But then COVID-19 hit, and that's changed everything, and kind of took away the traffic demands, and it was the perfect timing. So now we are in the process of implementing complete streets improvements in a way that takes away traffic capacity, but the demand isn't there. And I think what's going to happen is, we may not ever get back to where we were in terms of the number of people that commute 5 days a week. I think some people may have a shared situation where you may be home a couple days and in the office a couple days. And I don't know that we'll ever get to the traffic demand that was forecast, let's say 10 years ago, when everybody in the industry was thinking, gee, we'll never be able to accommodate the traffic demand that seems to be going off the charts. And I think that's now probably not going to happen. And that's a good thing, because then we can implement complete streets, get the improvements and the benefits of that, and not have to really have a downside of not accommodating the traffic demand, because I don't think it's going to be there.
And if I may add on, sorry, one thing I forgot to also say was another big driver is safety as well. There has been sort of a silent epidemic in this country, right, for many years, and we know that there is, somewhere between 35 to 40,000 people, killed each year, pedestrians being struck by vehicles and other auto-related crashes. And so I think there's finally a recognition that that's a serious problem, and design plays a big role in that. And so I think that's another driver for the adoption of streets that more reflect the usage and priority of not just cars, but multiple people, pedestrians, and things like that. But definitely safety is another big driver.
Absolutely.
Great point. I will call out if anybody does have questions from the audience, feel free to drop them in the chat. We have some great subject matter experts here. So send us your questions. But moving on to talking about the commuting patterns, Jerome, like especially you have so many bus signs behind you. Our bus systems have really been designed, so much around commuting patterns. Like we even have commuter buses that only run, 5, 6, 7 o'clock in the morning and then come back 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And we tend to have more service around those commuting hours. What do you see as the future of our mass transportation system as we exit this, whatever the new future is going to be? How do you see mass transportation kind of working with that?
Yeah, well, I can speak in, more generally, this applies to cities all across this country and the world. In some cases, I think the future is, really focusing on how do we provide. So there's a few things. One, providing not just commuter service or not even thinking about commuter service, but just service in general, all the time, all day. There's some barriers to that, funding levels and, availability of vehicles and staff. But, what we generally see is if you run frequent service all the time, it's successful and it's a viable option for people. And I think a lot of communities all across this country, there's been a lot of talk about commuter rail and commuter buses, and really, is there going to be demand to come back? I think it's still a little early to know exactly. We'll know in the next few months, really, people's return to work plans and how that's all going to shake out. And it may actually take longer than that. But I think there is a recognition that there has been kind of this peak service focus in the transit industry in general, where we're thinking about, the 9 to 5 commuter, right? And that, there will be some reduction in that. But I think what we're seeing is that a lot of folks that have been relying on transit, and one thing I'll say, folks that were called essential riders have always been there. This wasn't new because of the pandemic. It's just maybe being seen now, but people have places to go at all the times, whether it's going to daycare, medical appointments, going grocery shopping. Those things happen at all hours of the day and any given time. And the best way to accommodate that is to run service that is always there. So I think there'll still be, a focus on frequency, but also then access and equity. We may not have the resources to run 40-foot buses everywhere, every 15 minutes. And maybe that vehicle doesn't make, the most sense. There could be a different, maybe it is, just providing people with protected bike infrastructure if they want to do that, or, some type of on-demand or demand response vehicle to get to some of the areas that maybe, we have really tight streets in Baltimore in particular, right, where there's a lot of challenges that way. So I think that's, going to be another big focus too, is looking at where there are areas to fill in the gaps where it may not make sense for a fixed route. And then, of course, in general terms, we know in Baltimore that, we could use some higher capacity transit, and that could come in many different forms and different corridors, as was recently announced as part of the regional transit plan. There's now some new corridor studies that are happening in north-south and east-west corridors, which have been looked at before in previous studies. But I think it's important. One, also, there's a survey that's out with that now, by the way. So I can't remember the website, but plug for that survey. Please take the survey to help MTA understand how you might want to use those corridors and what's important to you. But I think that, looking at opportunities for different service types, whether it is BRT or, limited stop bus or some form of rail in the future, but I wouldn't get too caught up on mode, but I do think it's important to understand the corridors that are going to make sense for improvements in transit and really seeing where we can leverage those. And in particular with complete streets, I think we have an opportunity to think about different streets that could be designated as transit only corridors, right? It could be prioritized that way, and, transit signal priority for buses to help them get through intersections, different types of bus stop treatments, bus stop bulb outs, all of which are where we kind of bump the bus stop out to make it kind of closer and run into the street. I think there's a lot of like incremental and smaller improvements that we can make to make transit better as well. So I know that was a lot. I'm going to stop rambling.
Yeah, and Teddy dropped a link to the transit corridor survey that Jerome mentioned. We did get a couple, like, as you talk about the corridor not being tied to a specific type of a specific type of transit. We did get a couple questions alluding towards the red line, especially. And so this question is kind of for both of you, because Frank, you were very involved with the original building of what's now known as the Highway to Nowhere, which was designed in such a way that the red line could run in the middle of it. And the transit corridor study is looking at that corridor that kind of goes along where the red line would have gone, kind of going all the way to Ellicott City, which is a little further than that plan was going to go. So Frank, I guess first kind of asking you, what do you see as with the Highway to Nowhere and a lot of the discussion about removing that? Like what do you think were some of the things that went into building that didn't end up working very well? And what do you think is a good way to use that space now, I guess?
Well, I guess in terms of how it worked, originally the plan was it was going to hook up with I-70 out in Woodlawn. And of course, that connection was never built, and for good reason, because it was going to go through a park, which I think a lot of us would think is something we wouldn't do today. And so without that connection piece, that makes it certainly less functional as a traffic facility. It was built with the space in the middle for a future transit line, because that was built in the 70s. And of course, the red line planning came along later. I think there are different things that can happen there that can improve that corridor in terms of its livability. Right now, Franklin Street has a good amount of space to the left of it before you get to the depressed section that could have infill housing or infill development. Now that can be done fairly cheaply, or then you ratchet the cost up and you could fill up the hole. I guess my thinking is that we should have a good planning process to see how we keep those portions of that project that may be worthwhile, such as the transit corridor. And if the idea is to change what's down in the depressed section into something other than a freeway, and make it more people oriented. The trick is, it's 20 feet down from the grade of the rest of the city. So, we have to think about how practical is that going to be, or at least make sure that we do it in a way that we may have to get creative to make that, liven that up.
Yeah, and kind of the same question for you, Jerome. As there's, I believe it's $20 billion that the infrastructure bill is talking about, and obviously that hasn't passed yet. But one of the infrastructure, the bits of infrastructure that has been higher on the list has been the Highway to Nowhere. But there are still a lot of people who are really pushing for the red line to happen. So what are your thoughts on like how realistic it is to remove that infrastructure, and how realistic do you think it is to revive the red line plans?
I knew you were going to ask this question. Well, start with the Highway to Nowhere. As you mentioned, there is proposed about $20 billion in the infrastructure bill that would go to. It hasn't. There's still details that need to be worked out, but the idea is to make corrections and sort of repair some of the damage that was done with highway building throughout cities throughout the country. And what that looks like, is there are a few examples. Rochester, New York actually is doing some highway removal. Milwaukee, Wisconsin has some great highlights of how that was done. But that is the idea, that perhaps that funding could be used and they would, identify some key projects, and the Highway to Nowhere has certainly been discussed. people have a wish list for all sorts of things that Jones Falls has talked about. I think obviously there are a lot of things to consider. The highway to nowhere is kind of redundant corridor, right? It doesn't have to be there. If it disappeared tomorrow, the traffic would still be able to flow. So it's probably an easier one. So really echoing what Frank said, I think we should continue to monitor, look at that piece of infrastructure, see if funding becomes available, but just keep in mind and keep a corridor open for some form of transit, whatever that may be coming in the future. In terms of the red line, I won't go too much into that other than to say, there's a reason why that east-west corridor keeps appearing. It was in the 1968 or so Metro Plan and the 2002 Rail Plan, and now this one. So clearly, there's a prioritization of trying to move people east and west through the city that is needed. And that regional corridor study is really going to look into this and really kind of determine, what mode might be best and how we could do that. But I think, the biggest thing is just to keep open to newer ideas and different ways of delivering that service. But I won't get into whether or not we should revive the red line, but I will say it's clear that we do need some type of higher capacity east-west transit service.
Well, I mean, if you're going to be the Secretary of Transportation, I'm not letting you off the hook with that kind of answer. Do you think that, like, you have experience with using bus rapid transit, which is another, if we're not tied up in the idea that the best form of transportation is it has to be on rail. What are you, like? Can you talk a bit about what bus rapid transit is, and if something like bus rapid transit could end up being that east-west connection, that high-quality east-west connection, and kind of what is the difference? Like, what can bus rapid transit be as high quality as a rail that has a dedicated right-of-way and everything?
Yeah, that's a great question. Haven't had extensive experience with bus rapid transit in Indianapolis. Baltimore is a little bit different, though. Indianapolis, dead flat. We have very wide streets. We have a lot of extra capacity that we can take away from many of our streets. But however, BRT, I think, can work in any city, really. What is BRT? What's considered BRT is different between different. Depending on who you ask, but generally for bus rapid transit, we have some sort of dedicated right of way where possible, whether that's dedicated bus lanes, maybe we have off-board fare payment ideally, so that people are paying before they get on the vehicle, transit signal priority to help the vehicle speed up and get through intersections and save travel time. And then stations, whether that be fully level platforms or near level platforms. There's a lot of considerations, I would say, that would need to go into what we might do in Baltimore, depending on the corridor, right? Some streets are depending on the section of the street, right? It could be wider in one section, it could be narrower on the other. There may not be room for fully dedicated lanes the entire way. We also have to consider vehicle compatibility. Our bus rapid transit system in Indianapolis, the way that it works, we can only use the vehicles that we purchased that are specialized vehicles with 5 doors. So they have 2 doors on both sides because we have center platforms and side platforms, very similar to a train system. But those vehicles, our regular buses couldn't use the center platforms, and the regular buses also are not the same floor height as the platforms. Therefore, they can't pull up to the platform and unload. So that's definitely something that would need to be taken into consideration with whatever type of system, if we were to do BRT in Baltimore, and how that might work. But all those things, those nitty-gritty specifics will be nailed down in future studies. But absolutely, I think BRT or some form of BRT and different bits of that infrastructure can work. We're seeing some of that is being implemented on North Avenue with the North Avenue Rising project. I think that's a great example of really kind of preluding to what complete streets can be, where we're looking at that street and repurposing some of the space and thinking about the curb and how do we accommodate buses and try to move buses through those corridors a little bit faster. Yeah, I think it really is going to have to be very corridor specific and very area specific, depending on to really determine what's going to be the best use. But I think BRT could certainly work well in Baltimore.
Excellent. Yeah, and kind of putting a pin in this. There's been some recent talk about daylighting the JFX as well. It's an idea that has been kind of kicked around. I mean, you know, back like 2009, I believe, the Sheila Dixon administration had done a study, and it was going to cost $1 billion to tear down. I believe it was just a section. I think it was just like the section south of Penn Station, and a former MTA employee, Mark, I'm not going to try his last name, did a really beautiful rendering of what it could look like with the JFX, the Jones Falls daylighted, and with you know, walkability along the side. That's kind of, you know, it kind of pops up every once in a while, and that kind of popped up recently because Baltimore Sun columnist Dan Rodericks tweeted about it and wrote an article about it. So either one of you can kind of take this. Do you see? Do you think that is a realistic plan? You know, we're looking at potentially redecking the Jones Falls Expressway here soon. It's coming to that point where I think it needs like $60 million to kind of keep it going. What do you see as the future of the JFX? Frank, do you want to start this?
Well, yeah, and I think that answer might be changing a little bit. I think when this came up a few years ago, it was we were considering what it would do to the traffic that comes down to the JFX. And at that time, one of the worries was if you reduce the capacity on the lower JFX, it would push traffic into Mount Vernon. We didn't want to do that. We worked for years to get.
I'm sorry, Frank. Let me stop. We had a question in the chat. Can you also say what daylighting means, since I didn't explain that?
Well, the idea that came up is you would take the elevated freeway and make it an at-grade boulevard like President Street or Martin Luther King Boulevard. And so at the time, the worry that we had was that if you do that, right now, President Street's a very high volume for a surface street. And of course, the volumes increase as you get up on the expressway, as people get on at Gay Street, at Fayette, and, you know, Charles Street and all that. So if you do the daylighting from, let's say, Chase Street South, which is what was talked about, our concern at that time, before we got to the change of travel patterns that we had experienced in last year, was that it would tend to add congestion to the JFX in a way that it would encourage traffic to use St. Paul Street, use Charles Street, use Calvert Street, the parallel routes, which we had worked for years to reverse. We had worked to take traffic off of those streets. When I started working for the city, you couldn't park on either side of any of those streets in rush hour. Now there's no parking restrictions for the most part on any of those streets through Mount Vernon, and that was very deliberate. But Martin Luther King Boulevard took some of that away, and the JFX took some of that away, so that it diverts around Mount Vernon, and there's not really the kind of demand that you would need to put parking restrictions in place. And our fear was if you reduce the capacity on the lower JFX or on Martin Luther King Boulevard, you're going to push people back in Mount Vernon. We didn't want to do that. Now, that may need to be reevaluated in view of the fact that our travel plans and traffic, you know, trends are changing based on the COVID and some of the trends that I think we believe may stick around.
Yeah, so I'll jump in and say that, yeah, I think it's certainly something that needs to be looked at. I think it's in light of thinking about the JFX, Martin Luther King Boulevard, and even the Highway to Nowhere, when you think about kind of structurally what those roads have done to the city, and in terms of cutting off sections of the city and looking at kind of historic and structural racism and redlining. Those are things that we do need to be real about and talk about. And it's very apparent kind of when you look down on satellite imagery, right? Kind of where, some, physical parts of the physical built environment have impacted the city. Obviously, those are really complex conversations that we can't solve tonight, but it's certainly something that we need to consider and we need to look at and talk about and think about, what is the future of the city and how those pieces of infrastructure, have impacted us over the decades since they were built. And if we modify them and change them, what does that look like? And what steps are we going to take that would begin some type of healing process and kind of knitting the different neighborhoods back together? So I do think it's a worthwhile discussion, and particularly with the JFX, as you mentioned, Mark Zarkowski, that's his last name. I think he's on the call. But yeah, he did some wonderful renderings that just kind of, really explored, what we could do if money were no object, right? And we could really turn it into this really beautiful place. But I think we need to look at it in the context of kind of reparative healing for the city and how those highways also divided the city and created inequities as well.
I apologize, Mark. Love what you do. So changing tracks a bit from discussing interstates and highways. Doug Mowbray brought up a great question about the right-of-way art program. This is a program that the department has kind of expanded recently to allow for more traffic calming measures as well. I know there's been some people here in Southeast Baltimore that have talked about using planters or using tires or using various things like that can be do some traffic calming. But it's also things like sprucing out crosswalks or just kind of it's known as placemaking a bit. Frank, especially as we look at some of these roads that have a lot of extra capacity, especially with, when you're looking at places like, around Druid Hill Park, where, there's veritable highways around there. Jerome, as you kind of alluded to, a lot of these roads have kind of been used to cut off different neighborhoods. How do you see right-of-way art program kind of being used to do traffic calming or placemaking? And is that with even as we're talking about a huge infusion of money with highway removal, what do you see with some of these smaller $100 or $1,000 programs to fix up some intersections?
Well, let me jump in and start that one and say we're already doing that. I mean, anybody who's driven Hartford Road in Hamilton has seen that. We've got a lot of little spot improvements that we put in place with flex posts and pavement markings to reduce things like corner radius in places where cars were taking a corner at 30 miles an hour and jeopardizing pedestrian safety. We've done Hartford Road further downtown now, taking away a lane, and so I think we're agreeing that that's something that's very viable, and we have a lot of those kind of projects on the drawing board that you'll see in the next couple of months.
Jerome, you wanna jump in on that too?
I'll just say more generally that I think incorporating art into projects is always, I think, usually a great idea, especially utilizing local artists and really figuring out how to get people to have kind of a say and feel like they have a sense of ownership over their community. And that's really one great way to do that, is to incorporate, whether it's an art contest or just, through arts, various programs, reaching out and making sure that local artists have a chance to have their work displayed and be a part of it. And that's always a great enhancement.
Excellent. And we are getting towards the end. But I did want to, there's always discussion, especially when we're talking about transit, about how great the streetcar system was that Baltimore had in the past. And I've had some great discussions with you, Frank, about that history. You weren't part of the transportation department when streetcars were being removed. That was largely wrapped up by the early '60s. But can you talk a bit about what was some of the thought process behind that? Like I know that there's a lot of people that say that it was GM that came in and ripped these all out, but there was some sentiment against the streetcars as well at that time, right?
No, that's true. I was about 11 when that happened, but I remember what I heard adults say. And the things I remember were that there were complaints about, like, a streetcar is, a fixed alignment. So if there's snow or a broken down car or something like that on the track, the streetcar can't get around it. I remember they said that the flexibility wasn't there if you wanted to change the route. Let's say development patterns changed where you wanted to move from one street to a parallel street a couple blocks over. With a bus, it's pretty easy. With a streetcar, it's not. The thing I remember the most is the pedestrian boarding islands. And this is something I guess we don't do too much now, but the tracks would be in the two middle lanes of a street. The lanes just outside of that would have an island in them where the pedestrians, the transit patrons, would stand and wait for the streetcar to pull up. So if the drivers were driving along in the lane adjacent to the tracks, suddenly there'd be an island that appeared in their way, and they often crashed into them, which jeopardized the people standing there waiting for the streetcar. And so what they ended up doing is they started building these big concrete blocks at the corner of the island that kind of protected pedestrians, a little bit like you see at toll booths now. When you pull into a toll booth and they'll have a big concrete thing to kind of protect the toll booths from errant motors. And so that caused a lot of complaints. Of course, it's easy to say that then when they hadn't seen, maybe what the world would be like with only buses. But that was the thinking that I heard. I don't know if that was the rationale that was used to make the change. I just remember that the general population, I heard people's parents saying things like that said, oh, thank God they're getting rid of the streetcars. They're going to have the flexibility of buses now. So it's kind of ironic.
Yeah, especially as Jerome was talking about the bus rapid transit, when you're talking about the flexibility of the bus system, bus rapid transit kind of lacks that flexibility. Jerome, do you think that there should be concerns about going to bus rapid transit because it does require building stations and it becomes less flexible? Do you think that there is real value in a bus system? Like, just a few years ago, we redid the entire bus system, and that was easier to do because there weren't a lot of big stops that needed to be moved. Do you think that is something that should be considered?
Well, I think for bus rapid transit, generally you do want the enhanced infrastructure and you want the stations and you want those amenities because that does give it a sense of permanence. Generally, if we're going to plan a corridor and determine that bus rapid transit is the right mode, then we're pretty sure that it's going to be the right corridor for decades to come. And so there's usually not as much of a concern about putting in the stations and infrastructure that way. Bus rapid transit is still more flexible than a rail line, right? At the end of the day, we're still running buses. If something were to happen along the corridor, right, the bus can divert off, go around it, and get back on the corridor, right? We couldn't do that with a train. So, there is still inherently more flexibility built in that way. And once again, a lot of the nitty-gritty design details, right, about how it's going to be done, there are ways that you can add even more flexibility. As I mentioned, we talked about level boarding platforms versus near level platforms and making sure whether or not there would be compatibility for all different types of buses. So there's a lot of that can be discussed and worked out. But generally, I wouldn't be concerned about the stations and the dedicated lanes, once again, just due to the fact that if we're going to determine that a corridor is good for BRT, we're pretty sure it's going to be a good corridor for many years to come.
Yeah, Brian, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Frank.
I just want to chime in on that too. And I think that it's probably not fair to compare BRT to the flexibility of a local bus route, I think it is fair to compare it to the lesser flexibility of a fixed rail or a light rail. And I think in that way, BRT comes up as being a very much more flexible option. The other thing about BRT is there's like a toolbox of things that you can do, but you don't have to do them all. You know, with rail, you have to have dedicated right away from end to end because you've got a third rail that'll fry people if they touch it. So you have to have that separated. You'd be no place where traffic can cross a heavy rail line. But BRT, you've got the flexibility. You can have dedicated right away in 1 mile, and the next mile you can travel in mixed traffic if that's what's required. So I think it is a very flexible mode. I think there's a lot of opportunity with BRT.
I will say in general, and there's a lot of talk throughout transit, you know, about mode. We get really caught up on the mode, whether it should be a subway or a light rail or bus rapid transit or a trolley bus. I will say that I think that it's really important. What we love so much about transit, right, is transit that's frequent, that comes often, takes me when I want to go, where I want to go, you know, and the mode can matter. Obviously, a train, and if we think about the subway, right, like you can carry a lot of people. You can stuff like 1,000 people on one train at one time and move them very quickly, grade separated. But that, you know, that obviously that's really expensive and that might not be the best mode. But I think what's most important is how we design the experience, what we do to speed up the customer boarding and alighting. How do we move, especially buses, faster through existing streets? And I think that's really going to be a conversation that we need to have in the future. And there might be some difficult conversations about prioritizing traffic flow and, you know, directionality of traffic flow and who gets the priority. That's really what's going to unlock the bus system and allow it to be better. And as Frank said, there are a lot of tools in the toolbox to do that. And I think that's those are conversations are already starting and ones that we'll need to continue to have. Finally, I want to say really quick, the one thing we didn't mention so much about the future of transportation is bikes. You know, there's a great greenways plan that then I think we have 10 miles left, right, to kind of complete kind of this circuit around the city and fill in some gaps. And that's something that is kind of low hanging fruit that really needs to be prioritized and done. And I think that's going to be a great way to unlock another option for people. And you know, many people that are hesitant to bike, right, a lot of it has to do with the lack of really safe infrastructure. And of course, there's a lot of conversations also around bike lanes and what those mean and different neighborhoods those may run through. And those are real conversations that we need to have. But at the end of the day, the infrastructure needs to be there and it needs to be safe to allow people to feel comfortable to have that experience. So we don't want to leave biking out of the picture either.
We'll never forget biking. We could talk for another hour and not run out of things to talk about. This was absolutely amazing to talk to you guys. Thank you very much, Jerome and Frank. Really appreciate your time. Wish we could talk a little bit longer. But I do want to kick it over to Leah to talk about some of the other events that we have coming up. Frank, did you have something you wanted to wrap up?
Yeah, I guess just real quickly, and two things. One is that the city DOT has been going down the path of transit signal priority with a number of the bus corridors. We've got, I think, 4 of them in place now. I can't now remember which streets they are, but we're working with MTA to get TSP in a variety of the bus corridors. We've had it on Howard Street for light rail for some time. And of course, you've seen we've had the bus lanes downtown. So I think we're very committed to enhancing transit priority in the city of Baltimore.
It's an exciting time to be here.
It is.
It's an exciting time to be in the department. All right. Thank you guys very much. Leah, what are the events we have coming up?
Yeah, just to close, thank you again, Frank and Jerome, for joining us tonight. And thanks, Brian, for moderating. That was a really informative session. And I know I learned a lot about, especially the streetcar, which I knew nothing about. I did want to quickly mention that we are currently working on planning our events for the rest of the year. And something that we're kind of trying to gauge is everyone's comfort levels with in-person events versus virtual. So we created a survey to collect feedback on in-person versus virtual events and just different event types and anything else that you all are interested in seeing this year out of YPT. So the survey went out in the YPT newsletter, which was sent last Monday. And there's a link at the bottom of the email that you can visit to fill out the survey. It's also going to be posted on Facebook and LinkedIn, so keep an eye out for that. And again, thank you
It's
everyone.
also in the chat now.
Oh, thanks, Brian. Also in the chat. So again, thank you everyone for attending and have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone.